start with the quiz. You know the usual drill. I will read out the question. I will read out the correct answer to the question, and then I will provide context behind that particular answer. So let me just take a sip of water and we'll start. So, question number 1. The leader of the Chechen Republic has recently expressed anger and frustration at Russian losses in Ukraine and has called on the Kremlin to use nuclear weapons. What is the name of the aforementioned politician? The correct answer is B, Ramzan Kadyrov. So if you've answered B, Ramzan Kadyrov, you've answered correctly. Some of you have answered Alexander Lukashenko. That is the president of Belarus, not the leader of the Chechen Republic. So what about Ramzan Kadyrov and his anger? So Ramzan Kadyrov has criticized Russian commanders for having retreated from multiple occupied territories in Ukraine. Most recently, this refers to the city of Liman in the Donbas region that was recaptured by the Ukrainian military. He also accuses Russian commanders of leaving their soldiers alone to die and abandoning their posts, and is alleging nepotism in the Russian military in terms of appointing officers. He has also very controversially claimed that he would send 3 of his underage sons, who are 16, 15, and 14 years of age respectively, to fight in the war. According to official data, Kadyrov has 14 children, so he perhaps believes that getting rid of 3 is quite fine, and there are some rumors that he might have even more than 14. He has also called on Russia to use nuclear weapons. The Kremlin responded by saying that although they do appreciate his heroic contribution to the war, nuclear weapons use must be balanced and not emotional. And in doing so, the Kremlin seemed to hint that they understand that there could be very fierce consequences should they decide to use nuclear weapons in the war, because there could be very likely Western retaliation. Now, who is Ramzan Kadyrov even? He is the leader of the Chechenian Republic. This is a federal republic within Russia that in fact fought for independence from Russia in 2 Chechen wars in the late 90s and the early 2000s. And in fact, Kadyrov, alongside his father, Ahmad Kadyrov, was a Chechen independence fighter. But in 2003, when he realized that they were losing the war, he switched sides and he pledged loyalty to Putin's administration. He currently rules Chechnya with an iron fist. He is known for the assassination and torture of human rights activists, numerous anti-LGBTQ purges, and having practically total control of the government. He is a fierce ally of the Kremlin and as such is lavishly funded by Russia. An interesting fact to be mentioned here about Chechnya, unlike the rest of Russia, they have a Muslim majority population, with 95% of people in the capital of Grozny identifying as Muslim, according to recent data. In terms of the state of the war in general, the Ukrainian counteroffensive continues to advance. As mentioned, they've liberated Liman. They've also announced that the liberation of the Luhansk Oblast starts now. Their generals are very, very clearly pointing out that Ukraine needs to advance swiftly in their liberation operation because winter is coming soon and it becomes a lot harder to advance with heavy machinery through muddy fields and frozen fields once winter comes. Western countries, Western allies have continued to provide aid in the form of money and weapons. And lastly, I would just point out that we still have no concrete information on the sabotage of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline. We still don't know who did it. But in the meantime, EU countries have begun opening alternate gas pipelines to reduce dependency on Russia, like, for example, the Baltic pipeline and the Greece-Bulgaria pipeline. On to the second question. A general election was held in Bosnia and Herzegovina last weekend, to determine, among other positions, the makeup of the national government and national presidency. On the eve of the election, the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, Christian Schmidt, intervened by changing the electoral law to the benefit of a particular ethnic group in the country. Which one? The correct answer is C, Croats. If you've answered C, Croats, you've answered correctly. So very shortly about Bosnia. Let's try to explain Bosnia, because at some point in life, you will definitely encounter a Balkan motion. Bosnia and Herzegovina is a multi-ethnic state consisting of 3 constitutive peoples, Croats, Serbs, and Bosniaks, with the caveat that Bosniaks have a very unclear identity. Historically, the territory of what is modern-day Bosnia was occupied by either Orthodox Serbs or Catholic Croats. But with the arrival of the Ottoman conquest in the 14th century, a large amount of the population became Islamized, i.e. they took up Islam or were forcibly converted into Islam. These individuals have, through religion, developed a distinct identity from that of Croats and Serbs, but they continue to speak a very similar, almost identical language. The difference in identities is primarily expressed in religion, not nationality, which is why many Bosniaks do not refer to themselves as Bosniaks, but merely as Muslims. So in Bosnia, Muslim is an ethnic denominator more than it is a religious one, or at least additionally to being a religious one. And many Bosniaks do not identify with the term Bosniak. This is rather a contemporary attempt to fashion a national identity for Bosniaks. Bosnia consists of two elements, two building blocks. One is the Federation of Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is made up of Bosniaks and Croats, who mostly live in Herzegovina, the south part of the country, and the Republika Srpska, or the Republic of Srpska, which is a Serbian para-state in the north of the country. The entire country is plagued by ethnic tension, first of all, because of the Ottoman history. There is a large amount of transgenerational trauma in Croatian Serbia related to Ottoman conquest, and very often right-wingers and nationalists see Bosnia, especially Bosniaks and Muslims, as an extension of Turkish influence in the Balkans. Secondly, of course, because of the Yugoslav wars, the Siege of Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia being the largest and longest contemporary siege ever since Stalingrad, and of course the fact there was all-out war between all three ethnic groups and multiple war crimes committed. You've probably heard of the genocide in Srebrenica committed by the Serbs against the Muslim population of that village, but also lastly because of territorial and political ambitions of both Croat and Serb populations in Bosnia, but of Croatian and Serbian governments as well. So Croats in Herzegovina want to join Croatia, Republika Srpska wants to join Serbia, and both of these national governments, Croatia and Serbia, are quite sympathetic to those peoples. For example, Croatia still very much advocates for the rights of Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And this leads us to this particular election and the issue of this election. So, as we said, Bosnia is made up of three constitutive peoples. This means that by extension, the ruling body, the ruling executive body of Bosnia, the presidency, is made up of three representatives, one Bosniak, one Croat, and one Serb. And so far, this is logical. However, Bosnia has three constitutive peoples, but only two entities, the Federation and the Republic of Srpska. The consequence of this when it comes to elections is that all citizens of the Federation are allowed to vote not just for the Bosniak representative, but for the Croat representative as well. And since Bosniaks outnumber Croats in Bosnia and Herzegovina, the Croat representative is elected through Bosniak votes, which has frustrated Croats. And for the past two election cycles, Bosniaks have elected the Croat representative, which has led to a large amount of frustration. Before this election, then, the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina implemented certain changes to rectify some of these imbalances. Among these changes are a change in the number of representatives in the parliament of the Federation and changes to certain nomination procedures when it comes to electing the presidency. This did not nearly rectify all imbalances, but it did rectify some imbalances to the benefit of Croats. Now, you might wonder, who even is this high representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, and why do they have one? The war in Bosnia ended in 1995 with the signing of the Dayton Accords. Bosnia, first of all, does not have a constitution. Bosnia uses Annex 4 or Annex 5, I'm not sure which one of those, a part of the Dayton Accords as its constitution. And as said, it's also very ethnically unstable. And given the war and given the extent of the war, the international community concluded that there should be a system of external control over Bosnia and Herzegovina to ensure that stability is maintained. And therefore, they created the Office of the High Representative for Bosnia and Herzegovina, who is appointed internationally and externally. The rights, the powers of this officer include the power to adopt binding legal decisions in situations where local parties seem unwilling or unable to act, as well as the power to remove from office public officials who would violate legal agreements or violate the Dayton Accords. Primarily, this ties to territorial integrity. So the Dayton Accords primarily deal with territorial integrity of Bosnia. So if there was a politician in the Republika Srpska, for example, who would actually threaten to separate from Bosnia, to secede and join Serbia, the High Representative would have power to remove them from office. The criticism of this position is most that it's unaccountable and undemocratic, not elected by the people, but also overly Western, that simply people appointed from the West don't understand the context in Bosnia and therefore should not be in this office. In terms of the election results, we have Denis Bećirović winning the Bosniak representation, Željko Cvijanović winning the Serbian, and Željko Komšić winning the Croat representation, which is again controversial. He's the same guy who won last time, the guy elected by the Bosniaks instead of the Croats. At the Republika Srpska elections, Milorad Dodik was able to win the presidency again within Republika Srpska. This is problematic insofar as he's a right-wing nationalist who supports Putin. So we're going to see more pro-Putin policy in that part of the country. Moving on to question number 3. Anti-government protests continue to rage in Iran with no end in sight. Which event originally sparked the protests? The correct answer is A, the death of a woman detained by the morality police. So if you've answered A, the death of a woman detained by the morality police, you have answered this question correctly. Who is this woman? She is Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman who died on September 17th after having spent 3 days in a coma. She was arrested on September 13th in Tehran, the capital of Iran, on charges of violating a law that requires women to properly dress, to properly cover their heads with a hijab or a headscarf, and to cover their arms and legs. Having concluded that she does not follow this law, the morality police, a very weird concept where you can get beaten up or arrested for not following a particular concept of subjective morality, the morality police ended up beating her head with a baton and banging her head against the vehicle, after which she suffered internal injuries and collapsed after being taken to a detention center. The Iranian police claims that there is absolutely no evidence of mistreatment and that in fact she died because she had pre-existing health issues. Her family, of course, vehemently denies this and says that the government is lying. This event sparked protests by women across the country who waved their headscarves in the air and shouted "Death to the dictator," which refers to the Ayatollah, the supreme leader of Iran, Ayatollah Khamenei. This is interesting because in the past times in Iran, during the first half of the 20th century, during the Pahlavi dynasty, which banned the hijab and banned head coverings because they wanted to secularize Iran, there were protests by women who wanted the freedom to wear the hijab, which seems to signify that these protests, both now and in history, are not protests for or against the hijab. They're protests for the freedom of women to decide whether they want to express their religion in a particular way or not. This was followed by protests by students in Tehran and later by protests all across the country. So what started as a protest against the compulsory hijab law evolved into a protest against Iran's Islamic leadership in general. So this event, this killing of Mahsa Amini, ended up being an igniting event or a catalyst event. We very often see this with mass protests which erupt spontaneously. There is a catalyst, an event that's tied to some particular issue or a particular event that then escalates and protests begin to assume a wider meaning over time. So this happened in Hong Kong, where protests started over the extradition bill, but then in general became protests against Carrie Lam and the CCP governance of the region. We've seen this in Kazakhstan, where original protests started related to the prices of liquefied petroleum gas, but then escalated to being protests regarding corruption in Kazakhstan writ large, etc. This is the biggest challenge to the legitimacy of the religious rule in Iran in quite some time. And of course, what the Iranian government is doing out of fear that they might be deposed or they might be threatened, they have violently cracked down on these protests, including using tear gas and open violence, which has led to at least 133 people being killed by security forces, with most of the heated violence coming in Kurdish populated regions. The Iranian government is also trying to denounce and to paint these protests as not being organic and not representative of the will of the Iranian people, but rather externally orchestrated. They're blaming the USA and Israel, who within Iranian political doctrine are known as the large devil or the large Satan. This is the USA, Shaitan and Bozorg in the Farsi language, and Israel, who is the small devil or the small Satan, Shaitan and Kuchek in the Farsi language. I will also mention that activists across the world have rallied in support of the anti-government protests in Iran. So we're seeing a grassroots movement in support of Iranian women and freedom in Iran in general, not just in Iran, but also outside of it. On to question number 4. The Brazilian presidential election will move to a second round of voting in October after incumbent President Jair Bolsonaro's opponent failed to secure more than 50% of the vote in the first round. Who is running against Bolsonaro? The correct answer is D, Lula da Silva. So if you've answered D, Lula da Silva, you have answered this question correctly. So Lula secured 48.3% of the vote, so 1.7% short of being able to win the presidential nomination. Bolsonaro has secured 43.3%, and in doing so, he outperformed expectations vastly and will likely be buoyed by this result. Now, who even is Lula? Lula is a former Brazilian president who was in power from 2003 to 2010. He implemented multiple social reforms, most notable among them being Bolsa Familia. This is a reform aimed at providing education and alleviating poverty. So he provided numerous social welfare transfer payments to families, which were conditioned on children going to school and getting vaccinated, but were also conditioned and earmarked for specific types of spending. So you could not go and spend the money on, let's say, alcohol. You had to spend it on food, medicine, and similar things. The second program he implemented was called Fome Zero. This means in Portuguese, zero hunger. And this program was focused on providing basic food and nutrition, including funding subsistence farmers in rural Brazil, delivering water cisterns with clean water to areas where there were none beforehand, providing access to microfinance loans to families, etc. His policies were very popular, which led to the Workers' Party, his party in general, being very popular. So he was succeeded at his position by his colleague from the Workers' Party, Dilma Rousseff. But in 2014, started something called Operation Car Wash. And this was a large multi-year investigation into allegations of corruption in Brazil, mostly tied to the national oil company Petrobras. And the revelations of this investigation led to Dilma Rousseff being impeached, which was also one of the events that sparked support for Bolsonaro, because there was this perception we need a new non-corrupt candidate from a non-corrupt party. But this also led to Lula being imprisoned on charges of corruption. However, it was later discovered that the judge and the lead prosecutor in Lula's case had conspired to have him convicted and sent to prison so he could not run in the 2018 election, because he had intended to, and polls had actually put him ahead of Bolsonaro originally. So the question is, would Bolsonaro have won if Lula had not gone to prison? And in the wake of this discovery, Lula was released in 2019 and decided to run now. And progressives had hoped that Lula would win very clearly and emphatically, because Bolsonaro, throughout his presidency, had undermined democratic institutions, mishandled COVID vastly with hundreds of thousands of casualties, wreaked havoc on the environment, destroying the Amazon rainforest. However, Bolsonaro received more votes than anyone had expected, and the margin is uncomfortably small, which means that probably what Bolsonaro is going to try to do is going to try to steal some of Lula's traditional voting body, the working class, the proletariat, the lower socioeconomic strata, by appealing to them via populist narratives, promising them more welfare, promising them higher pay. And there are fears that he might be successful in doing that, especially as there have been recent other right-wing successes in Brazilian elections, including prominent Bolsonaro supporters being elected to the National Congress, as well as the state governor positions, including Bolsonaro's former health minister, Eduardo Pazuello, who was the one responsible for mishandling COVID and promoting quack cures for COVID, such as hydroxychloroquine. Bolsonaro has also hinted that even if he lost power at the elections, he would not leave power peacefully, which also sparks fears of a Trump-like insurrection in Brazil, something similar to what we've seen at the Capitol after Trump lost the election to Joe Biden. On to the fifth question. A Swedish geneticist named Svante Pääbo has received the Nobel Prize in Physiology/Medicine for his numerous discoveries concerning the genomes of extinct hominids, including A. Neanderthals. So if you've answered A. Neanderthals, you've answered correctly. So he made multiple discoveries related to Neanderthal DNA and Denisovan DNA. Denisovans are also a group of hominids who were discovered by Pääbo himself, a previously unknown group related to Neanderthals. So why does this matter to us? It matters to us because chunks of Neanderthal DNA, Denisovan DNA, and DNA of other human ancestors are still peppered through the contemporary human genome. Examples include a Denisovan version of a particular gene that helps humans survive at high altitudes, which is still common in modern-day Tibet, but also the fact that we have identified certain Neanderthal genes, which still exist in our genome, that affect our immune response to various diseases and conditions, including severe COVID-19. So, as a consequence of this research, we can actually better understand human biology and the way humans react to their environment, and perhaps directly apply this in fields of medicine, biology, chemistry, etc. So, through his work, what Pääbo managed to do is to sequence a full Neanderthal genome, and in doing so, through his work, he was also able to discover the Denisovans, as I mentioned earlier. What this allows us to do, what genome sequencing allows us to do, is not just to identify genes that we share with, for example, Neanderthals, but also to identify genetic traits and variants shared by all living humans, but absent in Neanderthals and Denisovans, which helps us better answer the question of why humans in the current form of Homo sapiens were able to survive as opposed to other hominid species. His discoveries will also help us just have a better understanding and timelining of evolutionary history and just increase the pile of evidence for the theory of evolution and for evolutionary science, which is important to combat alternative explanations such as creationism and their attempts to infiltrate public schooling. On to the sixth question tied to Korea. The Yoon administration is assembling a task force to fight the war on. The correct answer is A, drugs. If you've answered A, drugs, you've answered correctly. So the Yoon Suk-yeol administration is assembling a task force to fight the drug trade and use of drugs, according to a number of administration sources who spoke off the record. This initiative comes as Korea is facing a flood of illegal substances coming in from overseas, and as the use of drugs become more widespread in a society which was once known as pretty much drug-free. Historically, in Korea, for a long time, drug use was considered to be limited to the wealthy and those related to organized crime. But this is now spreading to the mainstream, with housewives, students, office workers, civil servants, and military personnel increasingly found to be using, and advertisements for drugs increasingly posted on social media, such as Twitter and Telegram. A particularly worrying fact is that more and more young people are beginning to be arrested for drug offenses. Of those arrested last year for drug-related issues, 54% were in their 20s or 30s. This sharp increase might be related to the fact that young people understand online transactions better, and they're using instant messaging apps such as Telegram, which protect their identities. After drugs are bought using cryptocurrencies on the dark web, they're often delivered by international mail or courier services. As a response to this, there is a pan-governmental joint investigation team being created, with the prosecution and police partnering with related agencies such as the National Intelligence Service and the Korea Customs Service. The crux of this war on drugs is likely to be large cities like Seoul, Busan, and Incheon, and this is where Korea expects to try to stymie the flow of drugs. So we're going to see to what extent the policy implemented by Korea is going to be successful. What some people in Korea are also calling for is an increase in the punishments for drug offenders, because some claim that drug smugglers prefer Korea as a destination because the punishment for drug offenders is more lenient than in other countries, but also because customs procedures are less strict in Korea. So we're going to see how that pans out. Moving on to the questions tied to the article. So you have an article related to capitalism, rigged capitalism, as the author calls it, and this will segue into our lecture, which will be about capitalism in particular. Question number 7 was, in referencing his previous work, the author provides a description of contemporary capitalism. How does the author describe the capitalist system we live in? He says that instead of a dynamic system of capitalism with fair competition, we're living in a rigged capitalism where there is instability, weakened competition, low productivity growth, high inequality, and a degraded democracy. So he thinks that capitalism today doesn't fulfill the ideal type definition of what capitalism should be. If you've answered anything to that extent, you have answered correctly. Question number 8 was, which 5 areas of potential reform does the author identify in the article? The first one is competition. He says we should prevent monopolies from forming. We should prevent the entrenchment of corporate leaders or leading corporations within the market in order for competition to enter the market, to lower prices, and to increase productivity and investment rates. The second thing he says is finance. He says that the unit cost of financial intermediation has not fallen in the US over 140 years, but there is also too much credit and too much debt within the economy, and he proposes a number of policy reforms to rectify that issue. The third thing, corporations. He says we need to rely on regulation to save us from the consequences of myopic business behavior and to limit the power that corporations have. Fourthly, he says inequality. There's large amounts of inequality, meaning that people do not have equal opportunities to access benefits and utility within capitalism. And therefore, the state needs to intervene with multiple types of policies, including providing education, providing decent minimum wages, providing tax credits, and actively intervening in the labor market. And lastly, he says democracies need refurbishing because, first of all, there is too much influence of money on democracies. But secondly, because there is also too much fake news that are floating around and misinforming citizens. And this also is the answer to question number 9, which is what is the author's main issue with how democracy works today? These are his 2 issues, the fact that money can buy elections and the fact that people are being misinformed. So he suggests more transparency and more consultative forums being used as a solution to this problem. And the final question, of course, always the opinion question, is do you think that capitalism should be reformed? And if so, how? Some of you said that although capitalism does have benefits in terms of competition and productivity, there are numerous issues within capitalism, like companies colluding with each other and there being corruption, and the state should be involved to solve that. Some of you said that there are basic services which we need to provide from the state and by the state, like, for example, education. Multiple among you have mentioned inequality as the largest problem within capitalism, as well as a lack of compassion, a lack of solidarity, etc. Some of you claim that capitalism should not be reformed insofar as it is the best system that we have and probably should continue to exist in this type of form that exists today. All of these opinions are quite valid. All of them are relevant arguments for and against capitalism. We'll discuss more about that in the lecture. But before that, we will take a 10-minute break. It is now 55 past the hour. We restart at 5 past the hour. I'm also putting that in the chat. So in 10 minutes, we restart with our lecture.